Howard will show at some point.
Okay.
And we'll have at least a few. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody, all of the people. It's great to be back, and we missed having Candy Lauren last night. But the cool thing about Zoom version is, wherever she is in the world, we can have her back for a bit. So thank you, Kanta, for being with us, and we'll get started with you. Now, here's the only rub, which I cannot believe they did this, and I hope that they can undo it. So the reform movement CCAR had been graciously allowing for the digital version, the flipbook version of our Siddur online, which is great. For some inexplicable reason, though, they eliminated the version we have, which is Shabbat weekdays and festivals, and they just left the Shabbat one up, which means that the pages are all completely off. So
the Shabbat ones has both, I think. Both
no,
pages.
so if you look at it, you'll see, and as a matter of fact, it was like that at the beginning of COVID, and then people asked for the other thing, and they produced it. So it's like 20 something pages off, give or take, from everything else. So I think this week we're just going to have to go with what we have. If you're watching at home and you're flip booking it, the good news about our service is that we very rarely jump a lot. And if we do, the table of contents is going to be your best guide pretty much in order to figure out exactly where you're going. So, Lauren, we're just going to announce our pages as normal. By next week, hopefully I have an answer to this. But in any case, we'll start with gratitude on page 186. And let me just...
We'll now turn to page 192 from Matobu. We'll now turn to page 194. turn to page 196.
Turn now to page 198. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lasach bivina lavchin me'ov uven laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam kokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Rokah haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzadei gaber. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish harumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten le'arev koach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavir shenam einai utnuma ve'apapai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani b'tzelem Elohim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tifara. Turn now to page 204. We'll read together in Hebrew at the top of the page, blessing for the study of Torah, and conclude with the English at the bottom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. O Adonai our God, let the words of Torah be sweet in our mouths and the mouths of your people Israel, so that we, our descendants and the descendants of all your people Israel, may know you by studying your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to your people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Now on page 206. Elu devarim she'ein lahem shiur, she'adam ochel porotehem ba'olam hazeh, v'akeren kayemet lo le'olam haba, ve'elu hen kibud avaim ugmilut chasadim, ve'hashkamahat beit hamidrash shacharit ve'harabit, ve'hachnasat orchim uvikor cholim, והכנסת כלה ולוויית המת ועיון תפילה, ואהבת שלום בין אדם לחברו, ותלמוד תורה כנגד כולם. All right, good Shabbos, Howard. Looking good. Flannel's looking good. All right, so we're on page 212. 212. Baruch shehamar v'haya haolam baruch hu baruch hoseh bereshit baruch omer v'yosef baruch gozer u'mekayem baruch merachem al haaretz baruch merachem al habriot baruch meshalem tzachar tov lireav baruch halad v'kayam lanetzach Baruch Bohodeh Umatzil Baruch Shemo Bishvachot Uvizmirot Negadelcha Unshabechecha Nefercha V'nazkir Shimcha V'namlichecha Malkeinu Eloheinu Yachid Chei Olamim Melech Meshubach Umufoar Le'ad Shemo Hagadol Baruch Ata Adonai Melech Mehulal Batishvachot. We're now on page 214. Mizmor Shilam Shabbat. Tov lehodot l'Adonai. Tov lehodot l'Adonai. Ulezamer l'shimcha elyon. Tov lehodot l'Adonai. Lehagid b'boker chastecha. Lehagid b'boker chastecha. Ve'emunatcha b'leilot. Ve'emunatcha b'leilot. Tov lehodot l'Adonai. Alei asur v'alei navel, alei gayon mechinor, ki simachtani Adonai v'fo'alecha, v'masei yadecha ranen, magadu masecha yam, ve'od ameku machshevotecha, magadu masecha yam, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך, מה גדלו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. אשרי יושבי ביתך, Odi hallelujah, Odi hallelujah, Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha, Odi hallelujah, Odi hallelujah, Selah. Continue silently on page 215 to the next. ואנחנו נברך ים, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה, 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 hallelujah. Hallelujah. We'll turn back to Cantor Lauren as we turn to page 218.
There we go. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
19. Nishmat kol achai tevarech et shemcha Adonai Eloheinu. We continue silently. We're now on page 220. Yilu finu maleh shira kayam ulshonenu rina kamon galav vesiftotenu shevach kemarcheve rakia veinenu meirot kashemesh vechayareach veyadenu frusot kenishrei shamayim Veraglenu kalot kayalot Ein anachnu maspikim lehodot lecha Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avotinu Ve'imoteinu. We continue silently. Now on page 222, the second paragraph down in here. Shochenai marom v'kadoshemo v'chaturanenu tzadikim Adonai la yesharim nava tehillah Befi yesharim tihitalalu divrei tzadikim Titbarachu b'lshon chasidim, titromamu b'kerev kedoshim, titkadashu v'makehalot, rivevot amcha beit Yisrael verina itpar. Shimcha Malkeinu bechol dor, v'ador yababai, yababai, bye bye bye, yababai, yababai, bye bye, bye 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 bye, yababai, bye bye bye. Ay, ay, bye, bye, ay, bye, bye, ay, bye, bye. We'll conclude Pezukei Zimra on page 223, which will continue then to Chatzi Kaddish on the next page and the Baruch Hu on the page after that. Yishtabach shimecha alad malkinu, ha'el ha'melech hagadol v'hakadosh b'shamayim u'ba'aretz, Ki lecha na'e Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avotenu ve'imotenu Asher ushvacha halav v'zimra u'zumemshala ha'netzach Gedula u'gvura tila v'tiferet kedusha u'malchut Brachot ve'hodaot me'ata ve'ad olam Baruch atah Adonai el melech gadol v'tishbachot el ha'hodaot adon niflaot Abocher b'shirei zimra melech el Hey haolamim. Page 224. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabam be'almadi brachurtei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael v'hagala u'vizman karim v'imeru. Amen. Yesh mei rabam mevarach le'alam li'amei al-mayam Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalem v'yitalam shemei dekudcha brichu leila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran ve'alma v'imeru. Amen. Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Leolam Vahed. We'll turn back to Cantor Lauren as we turn to page 228.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech We'll continue silently until the end of the page. We'll turn to page 230. Adonai Echad.
You join me on page 234. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ולכתך בדרך ושוכבך וקומך, וקשרתם להיות על ידיך והיו תותפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We're now on page 236. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי ביתיהם לדורותם ונתנו על ציצית כנף פתיל תכלת, והיה לכם לציצית וראיתם אותו וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם אשר אתם זונים אחריהם, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם אלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם emet. Okay, we'll turn now to page 239. We'll read together in English at the top of the page. Emet, there is no place where you are not, even in the wilderness, there is your word. Emet, that pen strokes of lightning, white fire, black flame, stir the soul's passion, guide our sacred way, true and enduring is Torah. Your truth for us is certain and established now and forevermore. Like Moses, Miriam, and all Israel, we sing out and rejoice. As we turn back to Cantor Lauren and turn to page 240. In a moment, Cantor Lauren will help us to begin the Amidah on page 242, and from there we will continue silently. As always, please go at your own pace.
Adonai sefatai tiftachu fi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise.
If you're still davening your silent Amidah, please do continue. For those that are finished and like to join me, we're on page 324, the repetition. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, Elohei Avotenu V'Imotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el HaGadol, HaGibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Koneh HaKol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot V'Imahot, U'Mevi Gula Livnei V'neihem, Leman Shemo B'Yahava, Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham V'Ezrat Sarah, Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechayei Mitim Atarav Le'Oshia, Morid Hatam, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechayei Metim Berachamim Rabim, Somech Noflim Berofech Olim, Umatir Asurim, Umekayem Emunato Lishenei Afar, Michamocha Bal Gevurot, Umido Melach, Melech Memit Umechayeh, Umahatzmiach Yeshua, Benemanat Alachayot Metim, Baruch atah Adonai Mechayeh HaMetim. And a good Shabbos to Myra. I didn't see you come on, but there you go. That makes me very happy. Very good timing. As we get to the Kedusha, that's a very, very good timing. We'll turn it back to Cantor Lauren as we're on page 326.
on page 329. Yismechu v'malechutecha Shomrei, Shomrei, Shomrei Shabbat V'korei Oneg Shabbat Yismechu v'malechutecha Shomrei, Shomrei, Shomrei Shabbat V'korei Oneg Shabbat Mekadeshei, Mekadeshei Shevi Shavat Kulam Yisbehu Veitamgu mitu v'chashabat Yismechu v'malechutecha Shomrei, Shomrei, Shomrei Shabbat Mekorei oneg Shabbat V'hashvi ratzita bo v'gidasho Shabbat Chemdat yamim oto kerat Shabbat Yismechu v'malechutecha Shomrei, Shomrei, Shomrei Shabbat Mekorei oneg Shabbat Zeichei L'masei v'reishit Shabbat Zeichei L'masei v'reishit Shabbat Yismechu v'malechutecha Shomrei, Shomrei, Shomrei Shabbat V'chorei oneg Shabbat Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu, Retzei, Retzei, Mimenuchateinu, Kadeshenu b'mitzvotecha, V'teinu chelkeinu b'toratecha, Sabeinu mituvecha, V'samcheinu mishuatecha, V'toher libeinu le'ovdecha be'emet, V'hanchilenu Adonai Eloheinu be'ahava v'ratzon she'apar kodshecha, Ve'anuchu b'Yisrael Mekadeshei shemecha, Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh hashamat.
We'll turn now to page 330. We'll read together in English in the middle of the page. On this Shabbat day, as you graciously receive our prayers, help us to hear your call. Grant us enough health to fulfill our duties and the compassion we need to attend to others. Teach us humility that we may perceive our own faults, and grant us the wisdom to be forgiving of others. Give us the courage to be true to our highest selves and the charity to see the best in those around us. Give us patience enough not to become discouraged, hope enough to overcome all fears for the future, and faith enough to know your presence. O source of blessing, look with favor upon us. May our offerings be acceptable to you. Baruch atah Adonai she'otcha levatcha b'ranavon. We'll turn now to page 332, and we'll begin reading in the English at the very bottom of the page. For the expanding grandeur of creation, worlds known and unknown, galaxies beyond galaxies filling us with awe and challenging our imaginations, modim anachnu lach. For this fragile planet Earth, its times and tides, its sunsets and seasons, modim anachnu lach. For the joy of human life, its wonders and surprises, its hopes and achievements, modim anachnu lach. For human community, our common past and future hope, our oneness transcending all separation, our capacity to work for peace and justice in the midst of hostility and oppression, modim anachnu lach. For high hopes and noble causes, for faith without fanaticism, for understanding of views not shared, modim anachnu lach. For all who have labored and suffered for a fair world, who have lived so that others might live in dignity and freedom. Modim anachnu lach. For human liberties and sacred rights, for opportunities to change and grow, to affirm and choose. Modim anachnu lach. We pray that we may live not by our fears, but by our hopes, not by our words, but by our deeds. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha ulachana lehodot. Cantor, back to you for Sim Shalom. I couldn't remember. Is that okay? All right. Sim Shalom, page 334.
שים שלום, טובה וברכה, חן וחסד ורחמים ורחמים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל ישראל עמך. ברכנו יוצרנו כולנו כאחד באור פניך. כי באור פניך נתת לנו, אדוני אלוהינו. שים שלום, טובה וברכה, חן וחסד ורחמים ורחמים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל ישראל עמך. תורת חיים ואהבת חסד ואהבת חסד וצדקה וברכה ורחמים וחיים ושלום. שים שלום, טובה וברכה, חן וחסד ורחמים ורחמים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל ישראל עמך. וטוב בעיניך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שים שלום, טובה וברכה, חן וחסד ורחמים ורחמים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל ישראל עמך. ברוך אתה אדוני המברך את עמו ישראל בשלום. We'll now join together on the bottom of page 337. עושה שלום ממרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל.
Hey, thank you, Cantor. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So in a few minutes, we're going to read from Parshat Emor. I'm going to focus on the sections that deal with the upcoming holiday of Shavuot specifically. So if you're following at home, in the Plowed Chumash, we'll be on page 824 in the Plowed Chumash, and page 734 in the Women's Torah Commentary. So 824 Plowed, 734 Women's Commentary. Both cases, we're looking for chapter 23, verse 9 of the book of Leviticus. And, Parshat Emor is sort of a funny one for me in that, by coincidence, a number of the B'nai Mitzvah that I have officiated over the years, for whatever reason, end up being this particular parsha. So I can count probably at least 6, if not 7 different, occasions, and I'm going into my 8th year. So it just gives you a sense of how many of the years there was some version of it. So it's unusual to some degree to be at this parsha and not have a B'nai Mitzvah and not be associating with that. But it's also a very familiar parsha because we tend to read this section. A lot of May birthdays, Lauren is correct. That tends to be, right? Fall and spring tend to be when a lot of B'nai Mitzvah happen. So it's probably not just me that has this experience. But Emor, again, also contains a lot of the descriptive elements of what is involved in the celebration of our major holidays. And remember, again, when I say holidays, our mind immediately goes to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. By biblical standards, by Torah standards, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not insignificant by any means, but they're not the the way that we hold them up today, right? The Shalosh Regalim, being Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot, are really the major holidays. But we also have to remember that Shabbat is considered a Chag, is a holiday, and Rosh Chodesh is considered a holiday, right? So that we actually have a lot of what are called, holidays in English, but there are a lot of different things. But the major holidays, the ones that involve especially the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the offering up of particular sacrifices. So there's a lot that ends up coming out of this week's portion. And as a tendency, when we have a big holiday, we don't read the regular Torah portion. We read something that is more germane to whatever it is that we are celebrating. So Emor again gets this sort of repeated usage, even though we may not realize it. It has a sort of recurrence in it. But I wanted to focus actually on just a little bit more technical stuff this morning. We'll see whether we get to any real deep stuff. But in thinking about this holiday of Shavuot that's coming up really in a couple of weeks, and in the sort of the reality that it becomes, ironically so, I think I'm using that correct, but it's certainly in an unusual kind of way, the holiday that is associated with celebrating the giving of the Torah becomes really the sort of forgotten holiday of our calendar. Many cases, right? You can take an average Hebrew school student and they'll at least have some descriptive elements for what Sukkot means to them, right? Because it's a big sukkah that we build. It's a big to-do. It's the 4 species that we pulled together, all of those things. Pesach, same principle, right? You have this image in our mind of a lot of rituals, the Seder, the matzah, all this stuff that gives us a sense of the holiday. But Shavuot becomes this sort of enigmatic one in which, partially maybe because of where it tends to fall in the calendar, the fact that it's 1 day as opposed to 7, which is part of what we're going to talk about in a minute, it ends up getting sort of, I don't want to say short shrift, but it doesn't gain the prominence that it really needs to gain. And so I thought actually, as it's appearing in our Torah portion this week, it'd be good to talk a little bit about Shavuot and some specifics about sort of, its enigmatic character, one of which is in its own name. So again, when we think of the holiday of Sukkot, you can mouth the answer. How many days do we celebrate Sukkot? Howard, you're my only person I can see. Sukkot. Well, okay, so not Yontif, the whole Chag. All right, so 7. Let's go with the simple answer, 7, right? Diasporic craziness will add the 8, but let's stick to 7 as the Torah version of, right? Same principle with Pesach, right? We celebrate for 7 days. So Shavuot, we celebrate for 1. Okay, which again seems strange because what does the word Shavuot mean? It's from the word Sheva. Okay, it literally means 7. It's the word of Shavuah is a week. Okay, so the weirdness of this being like, well, why are we celebrating a holiday that's called the week, holiday of weeks, festival of weeks, and we're celebrating on 1 day? So the answer, of course, as we know, is that there is this space between Pesach and Shavuot, and this counting of things a little bit different. So I want to just share a couple of thoughts here. First Talmudic and then Maimonides on top of it. So this first part is a little bit convoluted. I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly, but I'm going to try to give the essence of it. It comes from Masechet Chagiga. As you can hear in the name, Chag is the word we have for festival, a holiday. Chagiga is the section of the Talmud that primarily deals with not just sort of holidays in general, but oftentimes the ritual offerings that were given and the things that were necessary and all of that kind of stuff. So here's an interesting kind of conversation that gets us moving. So it says, Rabbi Bar Shmuel taught in the following Braita, which is a teaching from the contemporaneous time period of the Mishnah, but from something called the Tosefta. The Torah is said to count 30 days, as it is stated, a month of days, and then sanctify the month with offerings. In other words, when we're talking about Rosh Chodesh, the instruction in the book of Numbers tells us that we are meant to count a month of days. In other words, we count every day of the month, and when we get to the end of the month, then we sanctify it and celebrate it, and that's what we call Rosh Chodesh. Okay? And the Torah also says to count days from Passover and then sanctify the festival of Shavuot with its offering, as it is stated in our Torah portion this week. You shall count 50 days. Okay, this is where actually in Christianity, the holiday of Pentecost is a reference to the 50 days of counting. It's a different holiday, obviously, but it's connected to this idea. And so here you have us being told again that we're supposed to sanctify the festival of Shavuot, but only after we have counted 50 days, individual days. So from this comparison, said the rabbis, we learn the following halakha, the following basic principle of Jewish law. Just as the new month is sanctified for the unit of time by which it is counted, in other words, for one day, because we count the individual days of the month, therefore Rosh Chodesh is a holiday in which we celebrate right on a single day, even though it's like a lot of things becomes a 2-day holiday for different reasons. But basic idea is we're counting by units of days, okay? And so too is the case for Shavuot. It is sanctified for the unit of time by which it is counted. In other words, we count it as we're told. But in this case, we're told in our parsha this week that we don't just count the days, we count for 7 full weeks. We count in weeks, 7 complete weeks there shall be, is what we're told in the 23rd chapter, 15th verse of our parsha. So the Gemara, the rabbis of the Gemara then infer from this, does this not mean that we learn from the month, right? Shouldn't it be, if we're talking about it in that way, shouldn't it be considered more by months or by weeks in that case? If so, we can also learn that just as the festival of a month, the new moon, is 1 day, so too Shavuos is only 1 day without days of redress, without additional stuff. Now Rava comes in and says, how can you understand it that way? Is that to say that for Shavuot we count days, but we don't count weeks? Didn't Abaye, another rabbi, say it is a mitzvah to count days in the counting of the Omer, right? So when we count the Omer, that's what we do, right? Much more beautifully when Lauren is here and sings it, but we did it last night, right? Which is counting the Omer and counting it by days, but we'll talk about that in a second. As it is written, until the morrow of the 7th week, you shall count 50 days. And it is also a mitzvah to count weeks. As it is said, 7 weeks you shall count for yourself from when the sickle is put to the standing corn. Okay, and further it is written, the festival of weeks, Shavuot, which indicates that it is a festival that is established through a counting of weeks. Consequently, the days of redress for Shavuot should last a week in accordance with its components. In other words, the rabbis are asking this sort of question, well, it doesn't seem to make sense that Shavuot is a single day, right? It seems to me that we're actually counting both by days and by weeks, and that it should have a full 7 days of its celebration. Now, the counter in the school of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, a sage, taught the following. The verse states with regards to Shavuot, and you shall make a proclamation on this very day. It shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no kind of laborious work. This is also again from our chapter, and it states in the same chapter, and when you reap the harvest of your land. Which is the festival, they ask, as a rhetorical question, on which you make a proclamation and also reap? In other words, which festival occurs in the harvest season must be the festival ultimately of Shavuot. So what is this all basically about? It's the rabbis trying to reconcile what seems again a confusion, right? What is with this holiday of Shavuot? Why is it different than Sukkot and Pesach? Why is it a single day? And if we're counting the Omer and we're counting it, it's telling us, God is telling us that we're supposed to count 50 days, but we're also supposed to count it by weeks. So all of this long explanation boiled down leads to the unusual nature in which we actually count the Omer. Okay, so again, if we remember, Cantor Lawrence singing it, we don't just say, right, it's been 7 days. We don't just say that it's been 1 week. We say specifically and go out of our way to indicate the counting of the individual days and the individual weeks as we're counting. So for example, last night we said, and really today is what we were acknowledging last night, what we were counting today, is Hayom Esrim Shmona Yom, right? And notice, by the way, that that's not the straightforward way of counting in Hebrew. Okay, if you wanted to say 28, you would say it in a different kind of way, Shmonim Basra, right? So in this case, it's sort of indicating that we've counted units of days, 20 days plus 8, and then that we say Shehem Arba'a Shavuot, that it's been 4 weeks of the Omer. So we're trying to basically hold both of these kind of elements in the same place, and hence that tradition. So it's just important to know sort of why we do things the way that we do them is again, more than just symbolic. There is an intention to fulfill what oftentimes seems like contradictory information in the Torah, and the rabbis work to reconcile it through their rabbinic discourse that is generally emblematic of the way that the Talmud works. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, to share a little bit of Maimonides that I think goes a little bit deeper into the symbolic stuff and why in the end we end up with 1 day of Shavuot instead of 7 days, as the rabbis of the Talmud indicate may make some sense. So Maimonides says in the Guide for the Perplexed, he says, other holy days, meaning not Shabbat or Yom Kippur, which are distinct and are identified as single days, are appointed, most of the other holidays, all of the other holidays really, are appointed for rejoicing and for such pleasant gathering as people generally need. They also promote the good feeling that people should have to each other in their social and political relations. So Adas is making a broad statement about purposes of the festivals, is beyond the fact that God commands us to do them. They're also good for the soul, right? They're good for the individual, they're good for the community. They remind people of kind of, how we're supposed to behave towards one another. And, a good analog to this is to think about that very brief period of time in, for example, our national calendar in America, where, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, Hanukkah, you get a sort of different sense of the way that people are meant to interact with each other, right? Our better selves generally come out. We're kinder to each other. We wish each other a happy holidays, whatever it might be. There is something to it that gives us on a sort of on a human level periods of time in which we can both be joyful and also feel the experience of being social and relating to other people in our sphere. Now, the appointment of the special days, the Chagim, for such purposes has its cause. So now he's going to explain, what do we do with these holidays? Like, what is the main reason why we do them? Or at least one of the significant reasons. So he says, first, as an example, Passover is sort of fairly well known. Okay, it's kept 7 days because the period of 7 days is the unit of time intermediate between a day and a month. So in other words, that if you were going to celebrate a holiday that goes beyond a day, and we have no such thing as a holiday that goes for a full month, the appropriate unit of time, says Maimonides, is a week, because a week is something of a halfway point. He doesn't mean it literally. He just means that conceptually, in the same way that we would look at a clock and count seconds and minutes and hours, that the way we think of the calendar is usually in the passage of days, of weeks, and ultimately of months, and then presumably years. Okay. Now, here he then shifts to the holiday of Shavuot, and he says that the Feast of Weeks, the holiday of Shavuot, is the anniversary of the revelation on Mount Sinai. In order to raise the importance of this day, we count the days that pass since the preceding festival. Now, here's the key part. Just as one who expects his most intimate friend on a certain day counts the days and even the hours until they show up. Okay, so, as the rabbis do, right, they usually couch this in the phraseology of, a dear friend that you're looking forward to seeing. But, for all intents and purposes, they're really talking about somebody for whom we have a longing to see. Okay, so, and longing to see somebody means that there is an inherent anticipation that builds in us. So, we've all had that experience, whether it's for somebody who we consider to be a partner, a lover, just a very good friend, a teacher, whatever it might be, in that sort of classic TV mode of like showing a picture of a calendar and Xing out the days. That's the mindset that we're meant to have between the holiday of Pesach and the holiday of Shavuot, is to think of it in those kind of ways, that we count each day as a way of sort of counting down to the experience that we're looking forward to. And this, he says, is the main reason why we count the days that pass since the offering of the Omer, between the anniversary of our departure from Egypt and the anniversary of the law giving, in other words, the giving of the Torah. The key thing he says here is the latter, being the giving of the Torah, was the aim and the object of the Exodus from Egypt. And thus God said, I brought you unto myself, in chapter 19, verse 4 of Exodus. As that great revelation took place only on one day, so we keep its anniversary only for one day. Okay, so he's saying that basically the only reason really why Shavuot is one day as opposed to a week like the other holidays is that it actually was a singular experience. It happened on one particular day. It wasn't spread out over time. That's the way we are meant to relive it and to think of it. And if we were to do it in 7 days, it would diminish the experience as opposed to strengthen it. And now he says, though, that if that's the case, why don't we think in a similar kind of way of the Exodus, right? It's not that it took place in a day, but it certainly didn't take place in 7 days. So, why not consider the same kind of argument? So he counters that, he anticipates it, and he counters, and he says, but if we were to do that in the case of Pesach, if the eating of unleavened bread, which is the main symbolic act of Pesach, were only commanded for one day, we probably wouldn't even notice it. And its object would not have been manifest. For it frequently happens that we take the same kind of food for 2 or 3 days. In other words, if the holiday was one day long and we ate matzah for one day a year, it wouldn't really have any impact on us. It's not a long enough period of time for the symbolic nature of it to really kick in. And he says the reason for that is that it's not uncommon for people to eat the same thing over and over again for a couple of days in a row. That's not so unusual. So it needs to be something beyond that. And so he says, but are continuing for a whole period of 7 days to eat unleavened bread, its object becomes clear and evident. Okay, so what is this all really about? It's like I said, and Jonah, it was very nice. I saw your chat saying that you appreciate all this explanation. I'm happy because that's my intention. I think the way that we engage with our holidays is really reliant on how much we study them and what they're about and what their unique qualities are. And it's very easy to look at Shavuot and sort of say, like, there's so many things about it that just don't seem to add up or make a whole lot of sense until you study texts like this, until you consider the Torah that we're reading in a little bit, the Talmud layering on top of it and making what is in the Torah into some kind of practical application, and yet one that can oftentimes be sort of convoluted. And then Maimonides, generations later, trying to take that convolution and ultimately transfer it to a more straightforward explanation of why we do what it is that we do. So from this one parsha and from really one aliyah of the parsha, we learn all this stuff about a holiday that's coming up that actually really should be front and center for us. It should be we should be approaching it the way Maimonides says that we're intended to approach it, which is counting the days to it in anticipation of it, right? The excitement of what it means to relive the experience of receiving the Torah for the first time should be treated in that kind of way. And I think, a lot of times we don't do that. And I think that's one of the great gifts of counting the Omer is even if we're not intentionally in that headspace, even if we don't usually desire to do this kind of stuff, we have a ritual that kind of forces us to stop and take stock of every single day. And I think these are spiritually fulfilling practices. I think they're also from a sort of a mental emotional standpoint, they are very helpful practices as well. And our resident Musar master Myra, who is sort of in and out on our service today, but basically she is the real expert in understanding the connection of Musar and Omer and how we can really treat each individual day as an opportunity for a certain amount of spiritual preparation in the anticipation of Shavuot, so that when we get there, it doesn't just feel like we've kind of moved through it, right? I mean, it's interesting. Sort of the funny part of Maimonides' closing statement is the assumption that we treat Shavuot in a way in which we do get it. And I think to some degree, all of these arguments make sense why it's a one-day holiday. But I think if it were a 7-day holiday, chances are we probably would have more rituals associated and much more awareness of it. And because it passes in a 24-hour period, a lot of times it's very easy to say, oh, well, Shavuos is inconvenient to me this year, so I'm going to skip it. And I think that's something we should certainly fight to avoid if we can. So anyway, I hope we took away some learning from that. And as I mentioned before, my dad's actually going to be leading Torah study a little bit, and he's got some good stuff planned as well, so we can go a little bit deeper in. For now, we're going to turn to page 362 in our Sidurim, our prayer books, as we begin Seder Kriyat HaTorah. Ein kamocha b'Elohim Adonai v'ein k'ma'asecha malchutcha malchut kol olamim u'memshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor. Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai oz lamo yitein, Adonai yevarech et amo b'shalom. Ava harachamim heitiva v'rtzoncha et Zion tivnei cholmot Yerushalayim ki b'cha levad batachnu melech el v'nisa Adon olamim. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, udevar Adonai miYerushalayim. Baruch shenatan Torah Torah, Baruch shenatan Torah Torah le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo.
Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo.
Gadol Adonai Tiuner Hamema Shemo Yachdav. Lecha Adonai Hagedula ve'hagepura ve'hatiferet והנצח וההוד, כי כל בשמיים ובארץ, כי כל בשמיים ובארץ, לך אדוני הממלכה, והמתנשא לכל ראש. רוממו אדוני אלוהינו והשתחוו להקודשו. רוממו אדוני אלוהינו והשתחוו להר קודשו. Okay, so we're going to shift to our Torah reading for this morning. Again, if you're following at home and you have the Plat Chumash, we're on page 824, Women's Commentary, page 734. And Women's 734, Plat 824, and you're looking for verse 9. And give me 1 second, I'll share on screen here as well. Try a little different this week where we have the Hebrew and the English. Okay, everybody see it okay? All right. Amen. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל, ואמרת עליהם, כי תבואו אל הארץ, אשר אני נותן לכם, וקצרתם את קצירה, והבאתם את עומר ראשית קצירכם אל הכהן, והניף את העומר לפני אדוני לרצונכם, ממחרת השבת יניפנו הכהן. ועשיתם ביום הניפכם את העומר, כבש תמים בן שנתו לעולה לאדוני, ומנחתו שני עשרונים, סולת בלולב השמן, אישל אדוני ריח ניחוח, ונזכה יין רביבי תהין, ולחם וקלי וכרמל לא תאכלו עד עצם היום הזה, עד אביאכם את קורבן אלוהיכם, חוקת עולם לדורותיכם בכל מושבותיכם. וספרתם לכם ממחרת השבת, מיום אביאכם את עומר התנופה, 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה, עד ממחרת השבת השביעית תספרו 50 יום, והקרבתם מנחה חדשה לאדוני ממושבותיכם, תביאו לחם תנופה, שתיים שני עשרונים, סולת תהיינה חמץ, תאפנה ביקורים לאדוני, והקרבתם על הלחם 7 כבשים תמימים בני שנה, ופר בן בקר 1, ואלים 2, יהיו עולה לאדוני, ומנחתם ונזקיהם, אישר ריח ניחוח לאדוני, ועשיתם שעיר עזים 1 לחטאת, ושני כבשים בני שנה לזבח שלמים, והניף הכהן אותם על Lechem habikurim tenufa lifnei Adonai al shenei kevasim kodesh yihu l'Adonai lakohin ukratem be'etzem hayom hazeh mikra kodesh yeh lachem kol melechet avodah lo ta'asu hukato la'am v'chol moshvotechem ledorotechem ובקוצרכם את קציר ארצכם, לא תכלה פאת צדך בקוצרך, ולקט קצירך לא תלקט, לעני ולגר תעזוב אותם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם. Okay, so we'll return to our prayer books and to page 371 as we offer our Mishaberach, our prayer for healing this morning. Mishaberach Abatenu Imotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah Hu Yivarech et HaCholim Ha'elu. And this morning we begin by thinking of those in our community and connected to our community in need of healing. Sydney Ross, Roberta Kyle, Rivka Bat Yehuda Vabela, Eve Rose, Michoel Ben Hanania, David Kyle Klotman, Betsy Tepper, Samuel Moskowitz, Devorah Batsima, Michael Klinghoffer, Norma Paulsak, Amy Cass, Steve Levine, Rivka Bat Rachel, Gail Gambino, Leah Bat Naomi, Gedalia Ben Sylvia, Lorraine Danis, David Dowling, Sivia Devorah Bat Francis, Myra Peskowitz, Martin Stephen Blake, Chaim Leib, Deborah Block Kroll, Sylvia Orn, Michelle Sawicki, Francis Kirschman, Paul Eric Feuden Bat Esther, Shelley Newmark, Diane Axelrod, Gabriella Rose Spicer. And in addition to the names that we read, I'll invite those on the Zoom if you'd like to add additional names, or those watching at home to say names of your loved ones out loud. And of course, for us to still continue to pray for the people of Ukraine as well. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimalei Rachamim Aleichem Lachalimam Lerapotam Lachazikam Veishlach Lehem Mehera Refuah Shlema Min HaShamayim Refuat HaNefesh Refuat HaGuf Hashta B'Agalav Zman Kariv V'Nomar Amen. May the one who blessed our ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those who are suffering. May the Blessed Holy One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored and their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send them a complete renewal of body and spirit, and let us say together, Amen. El na refana la, El na refana la, El na refana la, Refuah Shelema, El na refana lo, El na refana lo, El na refana lo, Refuah Shelema. We'll move now to the Haftarah. Before we do that, we'll offer the blessing on page 372. Our reading this morning comes from the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 44, verses 15 to 31. That's found on page 846 in the Plaut Chumash. Again, page 846 in the Plaut. For those that don't have, I'm going to do what I did last week and we'll continue to do, which is to share screen. And we'll offer first the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza b'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai abocher b'torah u'Moshe abdo u'Yisrael amo v'nvihei ha'emet b'tzedek. But the Levitical priests descended from Tzadok, who maintained the service of my sanctuary when the people of Israel went astray from me. They shall approach me to minister to me. They shall stand before me to offer me fat and blood, declares Adonai. They alone may enter my sanctuary, and they alone shall approach my table to minister to me, and they shall keep my charge. And when they enter the gates of the inner court, they shall wear linen vestments. They shall have nothing woolen upon them when they minister inside the gates of the inner court. They shall have linen turbans on their heads and linen breeches on their loins. They shall not gird themselves with anything that causes sweat. When they go out to the outer court where the people are, they shall remove the vestments in which they minister and shall deposit them in the sacred chambers. They shall put on other garments, lest they make the people consecrated by contact with their vestments. They shall neither shave their heads, nor let their hair go untrimmed. They shall keep their hair trimmed. No priest shall drink wine when he enters into the inner court. They shall not marry widows or divorced women. They may marry only virgins of the stock of the house of Israel, or widows who are widows of priests. They shall declare to my people what is sacred and what is profane, and inform them what is clean and what is unclean. In lawsuits, too, it is they who shall act as judges. They shall decide them in accordance with my rules. They shall preserve my teachings and my laws regarding all my fixed occasions, and they shall maintain the sanctity of my Sabbaths. A priest shall not defile himself by entering a house where there is a dead person. He shall defile himself only for father or mother, son or daughter, brother or unmarried sister. After he has become clean, 7 days shall be counted off for him. And on the day that he re-enters the inner court of the sanctuary to minister in the sanctuary, he shall present his sin offering, declares Adonai. This shall be their portion, for I am their portion, and no holding shall be given them in Israel, for I am their holding. The meal offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings shall be consumed by them. Everything prescribed in Israel shall be theirs, and all the choice first fruits of every kind, and all the gifts of every kind, of all your contributions shall go to the priests. You shall further give the first of your yield of the first of the yield of your baking to the priest, that a blessing may rest upon your home. Priest shall not eat anything, whether bird or animal, that died or was torn by beasts. So if you ever wanted to know what was involved in being a priest, this is the Haftarah for you. That is for sure. And this portion, the reason why all this stuff is coming up in the Haftarah, again, is there's always a connecting point, or at least an attempted connecting point between what we read in the Torah and what we read in the Haftarah from the prophets. And it's because a lot of Emor deals with the very specific laws and rituals and expectations of the Kohanes. And, again, however we feel about that, and we should certainly have feelings, they are limited, again, in terms of what they can do, what they can wear, who they can marry, what their tasks are, where they're limited in them. And at the same time, they are benefited by all of these various things that are given to them and the way that they're treated by everybody. And so there is something of a back and forth there for sure. And one of a lot of the stuff actually that's listed here still apply to people who claim Kohen lineage. The one example that I most recently heard, which really blew my mind, but it's part of the tradition, is when you're a Kohen, you're not supposed to be around deceased bodies. So that means the obvious things, right, that you're supposed to avoid. But unless it's your immediate family, right, a spouse, a sibling, a child, you're not supposed to be anywhere within a certain, actually fairly significant distance. So Kohens generally don't go to funerals. They don't show up in those cases. And I had heard recently from one of our members who, when his father passed away, the rabbi who officiated the funeral was a Kohen, and so therefore couldn't be in the room, and was literally in a room next door. I think I told this story a few weeks ago. Was in a room next door being piped in on a microphone. So you couldn't even see the rabbi who was officiating. He was taking it. And there are stories about, people, Orthodox people, who stopped flying on El Al for a while because it's basically, you can assume every flight that goes from JFK, for example, to Tel Aviv almost certainly has somebody in the storage that is being flown to Israel for burial. So you had Kohens who take this stuff very seriously, who realized this and realized that they were technically within a certain amount of amot, which is the measure of distance in halakha, from the bodies in the storage underneath the 747. And I forget exactly how they worked it out, but they had to work out some explanation of acceptance in this case. But again, all of it comes from, at least initially, from this description. And then the rabbis in the Talmud and the rabbis of generations later expand upon this stuff even further, especially as the main roles that Kohanim, were used for no longer are in force because the temple doesn't exist. So they continue certain things and they diminish other things. And, again, this section from Ezekiel takes most of what the Torah says and just makes it even more explicit. So as we've concluded our Haftarah, I haven't done the final blessing yet, right? I just started talking. Yeah, okay. Page 372. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol haolamim, tzadik bechol hadorot, ha'el ha'ne'eman ha'omer ve'oseh ha'medaber u'mekayem, shekol devarav emet v'tzedek, al ha'torah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al nevi'im, ve'al yom ha'shabbat hazeh, shenatata lanu, Adonai Eloheinu likdusha v'lemenucha lechavod u'tifaret. Al hakol Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach mvarchim otach yitbarach shimcha befi kol chai tamid le'olam va'ed baruch atah Adonai mekadesh HaShabbat. Amen. We'll turn now to page 376 to offer a prayer for our country at the bottom of the page. O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation, alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace, and may we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. And together we say, Amen. Prayer for the state of Israel on page 377. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzur Yisrael, V'goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reishit Smichat Gulatenu. Hagen aleha be'evrat chastecha, ufros aleha sukat shlomecha. Ushlach orcha ba'amincha l'rasheha, sareha v'yoatzeha. V'taknem be'etzat tova milfanecha, v'natata shalom ba'aretz. V'simchat olam le'yoshveha v'nomar. Amen. O Heavenly One, Protector and Redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love, spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Together we say, Amen. Turn back to page 374 as we conclude the Torah service. Yeah, hallelujah, Shem Adonai, ki niskav shemo levado, odo al eretz v'shamayim, vayarem keren li'amo, tehila lechol chasidav, livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al tazovu, et chaim hi lama chazikim ba, v'tomcheha me'ushar deracheha, darchei noam, v'chol netivoteha shalom. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh Yameinu, Chadesh Yameinu keketem. We turn now to page 586 at the bottom of the page, Aleinu L'Shabeach. Aleinu L'Shabeach Ladon Hakol, Latet Gedula Leotzer Reshit, Shelo asanu kegoyeh ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama, shelo sama chelkenu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim u'modim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu. We're now on page 591. V'nehemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. We'll turn now to page 598, and before we recite the Morning's Kaddish, we'll think first of those who've passed in our community in recent months. Dr. John Abderkin, Faith Diskin, Linda Danath, Arlene Eber, Jay Fagan, Ellen Frank, Chaim Bear Greenwald, Arthur Grossman, Gerald Hirsch, Mark Joseph, Jane Beard Cass, Gertrude Katz, Deirdre Klein, Helene Krotman, Leo Leibowitz, William Littman, Audrey Lubo, Sandra Luongo, Morty Lynn, Jerry Monroe, Nancy Nagel, Harry Olstein, Jeannie Rubin, Howard Schreier, David Sent, Anita Sheldon, Alan Silver, Marlise Silverberg, Blanche Sklar, Rita Sandra Snyder, and Matthew Adam Zimmerman. We also marked the yard sites that occurred during the last week for William Bennett, Evelyn Block, Irving Cassell, Rose Kopelman, Henry Decker, Evelyn Gelb, Irene Goldman, Lorraine Haber, Robert Jonas, Irving Kelman, My grandmother, Molly Kessler, Harold Clapper, Heather Kotler, Bernard Dove Kriegsman, Morris Chris, Howard Mazel, Harry Oliphant, Dorothy Rach, Carol Reagan, Robert Saltzman, Lillian Saperstein, Jesse Siegel, Pearl Soroka, Martha Spitzer, Amy Stevens, and Martin Weiss. In addition to the names that we read, if anyone on the Zoom has additional names to add, you can add them in the chat. Those at home can say the names of your loved ones aloud, and I'll invite the mourners to join me on page 598. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, v'agalav v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam le'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalom rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Zikronam libracha. Every one of their memories before a blessing. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Some quick announcements. First is to join us for Torah study at 12 o'clock on Zoom. And as I mentioned before, my dad, Peter Geffen, is going to teach our Torah study this morning, partially to give a different voice and partially to give the rabbi a little bit of a break. So again, you can join him at 12 o'clock and all are welcome. A reminder that Nina Mitzvah will be meeting on Monday at 11:30. My Heschel class is at 12, Hebrew School at 3:30, and Social Justice Committee, its regular meeting at 5. On Wednesday, Hebrew School meets at 3:30. Please, a reminder that unfortunately the weather looks bad for Monday, so we have decided to cancel our Lag BaOmer barbecue. So still a good idea to celebrate Lag BaOmer. Monday, if I remember correctly, is not the actual day. I think we were playing around with that a little bit, but seeing as it is a holiday that's very specifically about one day, probably should celebrate it when it happens. But you know, if you like baked potatoes, this is a good holiday for you. In Israel, it's a common custom to have barbecues, but also to have bonfires, and kids, you know, wrap potatoes in aluminum foil and throw them in fires, and that became the holiday tradition. And there's some other very interesting mystical stuff that happens northern part of Israel. Unfortunately, last year was a real disaster, so I hope that it ends up being safer this year. And on Har Miron, it's a tradition. Yeah, that was last year, right? That wasn't 2 years ago when you were there. Lauren, was it while you were there, or was it?
And I think it was last year, but when
last
I was,
year, I think
the year before I was there was also another awful fire.
Yeah, it becomes an oddly dangerous holiday. Anyway, we'll talk about Lag BaOmer another time. Reminder also, the wine tasting at Shanny Daughter is still on for May 24th, and our Steven Spielberg focused film shul course on May 25th. Also a reminder, the first of Ruth Joseph's book groups will be held on May 29th. And keep your eyes out for all of the fun stuff we got planned in the summer upcoming. And certainly hope that you enjoyed this morning service and join for a Torah study in just a little bit. Before we get to that, we're going to do Ein Keloheinu, which is on page 626. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadoneinu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Mi Cheloheinu, Mi Chadonenu, Mi Chemalkeinu, Mi Chemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu. And we'll turn back to page 604 for Kiddush, but I left the Kiddush cup over there. I'll be right back. Okay. Go, page 604. Veshamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam oti le'olam Veshamru v'nei Yisrael את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. על כן ברך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו סברי. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. Amen. Okay. Good Shabbos, everybody. Shabbat Shalom to Camp Lauren. We won't see you next week, but we'll see you in 2 weeks. Good Shabbos, Myra. It's great to see you. Good Shabbos, Joan. Good Shabbos, Howard's Closet. And good Shabbos again to everybody watching at home. And again, Peter Geffen leading Torah study, 12 o'clock. Usually he's a pretty interesting guy, so my experience, I highly recommend it. And I'll see you all very soon. Good Shabbos.